Ah, you came back for part two. I bet you're just dying to find out what happens. So what I wanted to do here, and this is not necessarily required as part of your assignment watching this lecture, but I thought it might be helpful for some of you to walk through my understanding of these four imperial colonization processes. So I want to walk through with you what I found when I perused the same or similar documents that you did on these four empires and their colonization efforts. So as always, I am your host, Dr. Summer Cherland, and I'm glad you're here today. All right, this was your challenge. You were assigned a culture or a country. So you were assigned one European colonizing country. Then you were asked to fill in your country's information on the assigned table. So where's my table? Mine is, I filled it out on my Google Slides, but you would have had something like this. Maybe it's a different color, but it was a table with all of these cells to populate. Then discuss with others. So either in person or online, you were meant to have discussions with each other. But I wanted to walk through each of these things with you. So let's start with Spain. Spain is the first to colonize or attempt to colonize the Americas. Now, of course, we know that the Vikings, the Norse group, did show up in parts of North America a little bit before Spain, but they didn't have long-term establishments. They didn't settle long-term with colonies or any sort of extraction settlements. So we start with Spain. Spain's area of dominance really starts in the Bahamas, Mexico, Florida, all of the Southwest, and California. They initially call Alta California, that the coastline of California. That's really where the Spanish settled. They're not super interested in like mainland or inland California. Their dates of influence I set, and now I put these years because this is when I believe these, major moments in the Spanish Empire begin and end. If you have something similar to this, I'm going to be okay with it. All right. So dates of influence would be 1513 or so when Hernan Cortez arrives in Mexico, and all the way to 1853 with the US-Mexican War. Now, Mexico is its own country for about 30 years. Is that right? Yeah, about 30 years before the US-Mexico War. And so it's really Mexico that loses all this territory, but Spain plays a pretty big role in that, in part because of like problems with France. I mean, it's really complicated. So I go to all the way to 1853 with the end of the war and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So that's to me where I see Spain and its influence, its colonial influence lasting. So it's a really long time that Spain has colonial dominance over this region. What were their relationships like with Native people? Now, every one of these is going to be complicated. So there's parts that are like really easy to boil down, but there's always exceptions. But basically, it starts with warfare. Spain arrives in Mexico. They go to war with the Aztecs for domination over Tenochtitlan in central Mexico, and it's very violent. They try to force Native people into slavery, especially in parts of New Mexico, what is today New Mexico, and they spread European diseases to thousands of Native people who are not immune to European bacteria. And so we have immunity because you catch a cold every so often and your body builds up immunity to that virus. Well, the Spanish have been living with these European diseases like the plague for hundreds of years. And so they've become a little bit more immune to these germs. And the Native people had no exposure to those germs. So they died very quickly, many of them. After a while, Spain begins to endorse intermarriage. Now, when we look at relationships with Native people on an imperial scale, my bad, we look at relationships with Native people as it pertains to marriage. Were they allowed to intermarry or not? And if not, why not? And if so, why? It's a real good indicator about the approach of the empire to the people that were already living there. So over time, intermarriage becomes part of the Spanish lifestyle in colonial New Spain, as they called it. And it leads to this concept of the mestizaje, or the mixed race, which also, or in other ways, is called la casta. So you can use la casta, L-A-C-A-S-T, either E or A. I've seen it both ways. La casta is the ranking of people's racial purity based on who their parents are. So that's where we get new terms like mestizo or mulatto. We see those kinds of terms used for people who have mixed race or parents of mixed race. And then another aspect of their relationships with Native people is that Spain has sent, remember those 3 Gs, glory, gold, and God. So Spain sends thousands of missionaries, Jesuit and Franciscan priests, to civilize and colonize the native people under the banner of Catholicism. How Spanish colonists interacted with the home country is mostly through missions, so through that sort of Catholic oversight. Also, viceroyalties. So this is unique. Spain didn't sponsor colonial settlements. They sponsored the expedition for the most part. But if you had enough money, you could go be a vice mayor or a vice king kind of in your own community. You could buy land from the crown, not from the native people who already lived there, and establish what's called a viceroyalty. They were an extraction community. They were an extraction colony, which means we extract or take as many resources and send them back to the Spanish continent or the Spanish country. We do not keep those materials here and benefit from them here. And as I mentioned, there's a concept of racial purity in the creation of the mestizaje or la casta as a way to rank order of people based on their heritage. Those 3 Gs were basically the foundations of the economic and political structure. Colonists were there for glory, gold, or God. That's it. There's no new organization of politics or economics until a little bit later in New Spain. What is going to threaten Spain? Why aren't we the United States of Spain? What's causing downfall? I mean, they look at that. They were here for over 300 years with colonial emphasis in the Southwest. What brought about their demise? Well, they have huge spans of territory. Think about it. South America, Mesoamerica, or Central America, all of the Southwest, Florida, California. This is a huge span of territory that the Spanish crown, the Spanish nobility, is claiming to control. It's a majorly spread out territory, which means people in different aspects or places of the colonial empire don't have a whole lot in relationship or in common with other people in the exact same empire. So people who lived in Texas over time see themselves as Tejanos. They do not see themselves as Mexican. They do not see themselves as Spanish. Same with Californios or Hispanos in New Mexico. So Spain struggles. Also, the French and the British are competing with them. So they have competition from other European forces. And then eventually what brings about the demise of Spain's holding is American expansionism. So America moving in to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. So check your chart. If you were assigned Spain, did you mostly agree with me? Why or why not? All right, let's go into France. France is second to arrive. France controls primarily the Midwest, Canada, major bodies of water, including the Mississippi, New Orleans, the port of New Orleans, the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. So that is huge. When you control the water, you control trade. You control the influx of people. By 1800, their claims to these waterways are disputed. So they have about 200 years that they're here, from 1608 to 1803. For the most part, France was relatively agreeable with the native people. They emphasized trade of fur and weapons. They created temporary political alliances, and they were fairly cooperative with native people. Now, they did also spread European diseases, so they brought about the demise of other native people, just like the Spanish did. But they allowed for intermarriage. And this comes back in a moment. I'm gonna tell you about it in a little second. But France was known mostly in terms of their relationships with native people for their willingness to accept intermarriage. And I think some of that was a political and economic choice in an effort to maintain or create alliances. Now, remember, European empires have always traded marriage as a way to consolidate empire, consolidate space, consolidate nobility. So it wouldn't be that far out of the regular for them to endorse intermarriage with powerful native people. It was primarily men, but some women. So primarily French men who would marry native women and typically have children with them. Now, they were temporary. So that gets us to this next point, relationships with home country. France saw their colonization efforts as relatively temporary. People were sent there, but they were always meant to come home, which meant oftentimes men left behind families. They left behind wives and children when they returned back home and started new families. They had a proprietary style of governance, meaning they were able to kind of function independently for a while, but they later came under royal control because Napoleon Bonaparte was trying to consolidate power. And then finally, what caused France? Why we're not the United States of France? Why France wasn't able to function forever as a colonial empire in America was they exhausted their resources. And more importantly, there was turmoil in France. There was the French Revolution. There was the expansion of empire under Napoleon Bonaparte. And there was just an ongoing conflict in Europe that meant Spain or France was not able to endorse or finance long-term colonization efforts. I think you could also look at this and say, like, well, if they were always temporary, right? If they were supposed to be temporary, they probably were never going to be completely dominant in the New World. How about Holland? Very different structure. All right. Spain, the crown, the king and queen of Spain, financed the expeditions into the Americas, and then individuals finance their own settlements. In France, the crown finances the expeditions, always with the understanding that individuals will not stay forever, so they don't need the money to set up shop forever. Totally different deal when it comes to the Netherlands. The Netherlands, or Holland, or the Dutch, either one of those they're all interchangeable, dominated the areas of the Hudson River Valley, so mostly New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. They were only here, they were here for longer, but their major influence spans about 70 years, 65 or so, 1609 to 1674, fairly short reign. They were inspired by kind of legal theories. They did have some violence against Native people, but they were mostly disgusted by Spain's treatment of Native people. And they sought to appear as dealing with natives as equals, right? Now, they tended to be very different when it came to their relationships with the home country. It's really unique. It's very different from the other three empires. I'm going to tell you about that in just a moment. All right, here's where things are different for Holland. With Spain, France, and Great Britain, primarily the government, the royal government, sponsors these expeditions and or settlements. Holland is super different. Holland has corporations. Think just like corporations today, just like Apple or Google or Amazon. Any sort of major company financing these expeditions into the New World. So they are approaching this as a primarily economic enterprise. So whereas Great Britain, well, let's do Spain because we've already talked about them. So whereas Spain is sending people for glory God, right? Glory meaning for the empire, God for the Catholic Church, which is the official church in Spain, and gold for the empire. Really, Holland is sending people for the gold part and not even for the empire, for the companies. So you'll see on the economic and political structure, there are a couple different companies that are founded, the Dutch East and West India companies that finance expeditions into North America in those very specific regions of New England. There were settlements. So people did settle, they did move in, like they set up shop basically, but they were really set up in a corporate structure, not a political structure. So really very different. And what threatens the Netherlands and this model, because actually this becomes a really crucial component of understanding American colonization, but what threatens their dominance is the English, because the British, English, British, those are the same thing in this terminology. The British set up shop almost in the exact same place as the Dutch, which causes tension. But the other reason is because there's no royal backing. There's no national backing or patriotic backing to this. No one's there for the Netherlands. They're there for a company. People have different motivations. Like think about if you're sent overseas by, in the military, that's different than if you're sent overseas by your job, by your career. And I know military is a job, but what I mean is like a company is different from your country. Do you know what I mean? So that is a distinction of the Netherlands. I think that's really important, and it's crucial to understanding the next thing, which is big, bad Great Britain. Now, Great Britain is not here as long as the Spanish, but they're here pretty long, 1600 to 1812. And Great Britain makes the biggest impact on American economy and culture when it comes to the way the colonies were set up and the way the colonies eventually revolted. So their areas of influence are the Chesapeake, which is Jamestown, think Maryland. If you know the American map, if you look at the Atlantic Ocean, there's a part where there's a little like triangle that pokes out, that's the Chesapeake. And that goes all the way to maybe northern parts of Georgia, but into sort of the south. But Spain has lots in France too, in weird ways. Florida and Georgia are controlled a lot by Spain at this time. And then into New England, where Holland is. They're here from 1600 to 1812. Now, you could also say 1776, because that's the American Revolution. But 1812 is the War of 1812, which is the decisive battle that ends all colonization efforts of Great Britain into perpetuity. So if you put 1776 or 1817 or 1812 rather, I will accept either of those. Great Britain, not so good with the native people. They were hostile. They did attempt to trade with native people, but they were very violent. There was a lot of xenophobia, fear, hatred, beliefs that native people were savage and followed outdated pagan ritual type religion that needed to be eradicated from this planet. Whereas Spain really saw their role as religious missionaries, England saw their role as religious purifiers. They did not allow for intermarriage. I'm sure there was some here and there, but they did not allow for it. They were racist when it came to their approach to faith. Okay, so the crown, when it comes to relationships with the home country, how did these people function? How did these colonists function in relationship to their country? The crown, the royal government, sponsored the English theft of land. So I use that word intentionally. They sponsored the claim of these lands. They paid for it, but they assumed that this land was open for the taking. But native people have been living here for centuries. They provided money, resources, and people. They sponsored piracy and privateering. So steal, beg, borrow, and steal, and the state supports you. They really, the reason England, not Spain, has the longest and most significant impact on American politics and culture is because they really emphasized permanent settlements. They sent people to the Americas not just to extract resources, but to set up shop and stay there forever. And the way they benefited from that economically was they taxed their own citizens. So not only are you sending lumber back or sending red dye or whatever you're sending, potatoes, not only are you sending the materials that you are contracted to send back to the country of origin, you're also being taxed on that. You also have to pay a tax for doing that. It's like when you return something for an online purchase and you have to still pay shipping. You're still paying for it, even though you're benefiting from it financially. So what brings about the demise of England? Because England's colonies are the most powerful, ultimately in the end. Well, there's problems with the other empires. Spain, France, and Holland are all wanting the same piece of the same pie, or maybe bigger pieces of the same pie. They also have problems with native people. Native people resisted the violence of the British. They resisted the expansionists of the British. They didn't want colonists in their lands. And then most importantly, Americans, the colonists themselves, who were sponsored by the crown, are the biggest problem in the end. That's the threat that England faces. That's why England does not survive as a colony, a colonizing effort in perpetuity, right? They last for about 200 years. All right, hopefully you got the same stuff as I did, or close to, because that's what we do as historians. We use the same sources, and then we try to drill down and we compare what we see. Hopefully that helps you with your chart, and I look forward to hearing what you have learned this week, and I look forward to seeing your work. Bye, everybody.